Bells once rang through the palaces of Madrid to announce the reign of Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain. Yet behind the marble doors, his body trembled with an illness no physician could cure. Courtiers saw a monarch gripped by visions, pacing through sleepless nights, whispering fragments of prayers while his hands shook as if seized by invisible chains. Around him, the nobility stood powerless, their powdered faces pale, their silken gloves hiding skin already scarred by generations of toxic remedies that promised grace but delivered decay. In this world of decline, one figure refused to bend. Elisabeth Farnese arrived from Parma, a bride many believed to be weak, insignificant, a woman without allies who would yield easily to the will of stronger men. They expected a silent consort. Yet what they received was a queen whose calm voice could still a hall in uproar, a queen who turned the fragile state of her husband into the foundation of her own authority. Where others saw only a suffering king, she saw an empire waiting to be ruled, and she alone held the vials and words that could bring Philip peace for an hour, or plunge the court into deeper fear. This is not a fable softened by time. It is a chapter of history where shadows lingered longer than triumphs. Elisabeth Farnese was neither adored for beauty nor remembered for tenderness, but for the cold certainty that without her the king could not stand. Tonight you will follow how she stepped from obscurity into power, how suspicion became her crown, and how fear itself became her weapon. Watch until the final moment of this story, because each turn reveals a truth more unsettling than the last. And if you wish to continue uncovering the hidden corners of history where survival and downfall balanced on a single breath, subscribe now and walk with us deeper into the corridors of power. The Palace of Parma was not a place of music and laughter in Elizabeth's childhood. It was a place wrapped in mourning. Her father, Odoardo, heir to the duchy, died when she was still an infant. His absence left more than a void at the family table. It left a silence that settled like dust in every corridor. She grew up under the strict gaze of her widowed mother, Dorothea Sophie of Neuburg, a woman who carried German discipline in her bones and taught her daughter that tenderness was a luxury no Farnese child could afford. The girl was not the kind whose beauty would open doors. Courtiers noted her pale skin, her long face, her expression that seemed older than her years. Other girls in noble houses were praised for bright smiles and hair like gold, but Elizabeth was described as serious, almost severe. She listened more than she spoke, memorizing gestures, learning to read hesitation and pride. The absence of compliments did not break her, it sharpened her. In the ducal library she found solace. Rows of books and forgotten manuscripts became her companions. One winter afternoon, a faithful servant, sorting through a chest of neglected papers, brought to her a packet marked with the name Paracelsus. The parchment was cracked, the Latin faded, yet the words still held power. Elizabeth traced them carefully, mouthing each phrase until they took root in her mind. She discovered a doctrine that beauty and poison could be siblings, that a single drop could heal or destroy. When the servant asked what she had found, she looked up from the page with a gaze too steady for a child. It says that everything men admire can also be the cause of their ruin. Her mother noticed her long nights spent in the flicker of candlelight, but Dorothea Sophie did not forbid it. She only placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder once and spoke in a low voice. "Remember, child, beauty fades, but a mind that watches will endure." Those words became a vow. Visitors to Parma sometimes recorded their impressions of the young princess. An envoy from Modena wrote that she was not charming like her cousins, but when he spoke with her, she replied with a calmness that unsettled him. She told him, Appearances are fragile. What is admired today may be ash tomorrow. The envoy left convinced that she carried in her eyes something closer to man than to innocence. Elisabeth watched the women of Parma apply powders and oils, all convinced that their whitened faces were proof of refinement. She noticed the way their skin cracked beneath the disguise, how fatigue set deep in their features. In the secret notes of Paracelsus, she had already read the truth. What was called beauty was often the slow poison of vanity. So the child of Parma, plain in appearance but sharp in thought, grew in silence. She carried no crown, no admiration, yet she carried knowledge hidden from all others. The brittle pages of a forgotten physician and the stern lessons of a widowed mother became her inheritance. While others trusted in charms and painted faces, Elisabeth trusted in the power of watching, waiting, and understanding what others refused to see. The seeds were planted in those quiet years, seeds that would one day grow into a force strong enough to bend kings and silence courts. After the death of Maria Luisa of Savoy, the court of Spain was thrown into uncertainty. Philip V, already fragile in mind and spirit, needed a new queen. But the choice was not his alone. Versailles tightened its grip, determined to place beside him a woman who would not disturb the balance of French influence. They wanted someone pliant, someone without allies, someone who could be shaped like clay. When the name of Elisabeth Farnese of Parma was suggested, a murmur of approval passed through the salons of Paris and the halls of Madrid. A plain princess, orphaned of her father, without dazzling beauty or powerful kin, she was declared the perfect lamb to lead to the altar. Cardinal Giulio Alberoni, himself a man of Parma who had risen to prominence in Spain, championed the match. He whispered to courtiers that she would be his instrument. "A small bird from Parma will sing the tune we choose," he assured them. Nobles repeated the phrase, laughing into their cups of wine, certain they had chosen a queen who could be guided with ease. The wedding in Parma was modest compared to the splendor of Spanish tradition. Yet the new queen entered Madrid with quiet composure. The courtiers studied her pale face, her reserved manner, and congratulated themselves on a wise choice. They believed she would bend to their wills. But in the intimacy of the royal chambers, the truth unfolded very differently. Philip was restless, tormented by visions, often refusing to eat or leave his darkened rooms. He muttered prayers into the night, his hands trembling so violently that even seasoned attendants recoiled. Ministers despaired, unsure how to govern under a monarch so broken. Then Elisabeth stepped forward, calm where others faltered. She sat beside him through his storms, her hand steady on his arm, her voice low and unwavering. One night, as he shivered beneath heavy robes, Philip whispered to her with the desperation of a man drowning, "They want a king, but I have no strength left to give." Elisabeth leaned close, her words a quiet command disguised as comfort. "Then let them take me as your strength. What you cannot carry, I will bear." From then on, she prepared herbal drafts drawn from her private study, remedies no one else dared to administer. She reminded him of order when his mind unraveled, gave him words when silence consumed him. The Italian physician José Servi, called to examine the monarch, noted with astonishment that the king responded to her presence more than to any treatment he prescribed. Servi later confessed that it seemed as if the queen herself was the only true medicine. Rumors began to spread in the corridors of Madrid. Some said she had bewitched the king, others that she had found the secret key to his troubled mind. What none could deny was that audiences with Philip now passed through her hands. Courtiers discovered that to speak to the king They first needed the favor of the queen. Alberoni, who had once boasted that she was his puppet, found himself pushed to the margins. Ministers who thought they could shape her began instead to fear her judgment. Nobles who mocked her plain looks now lowered their eyes when she entered a room. The very lamb they had chosen revealed herself as something far more dangerous. A chronicler of the time, Marquis de San Felipe, wrote with astonishment that the new queen commanded more authority in months than many ministers had achieved in decades. He admitted that she had become the true center of power in Spain, not by decree or open defiance, but by binding the king's fragile soul to her will. Whispers grew darker still. Did she cure him, or did she keep him in weakness to ensure her dominance? No one could prove anything. They only saw a monarch ever more dependent on her presence, and a queen who had turned dismissal into dominion. The gamble of Versailles had failed. The men who thought they were leading a lamb into the palace now understood the truth. They had opened the gates to a wolf from Parma, cloaked in silk, and she had already sunk her teeth into the heart of the Spanish throne. Under the vaulted ceilings of Madrid, suspicion thickened like smoke. Courtiers whispered when Elisabeth Farnese passed, calling her the Italian witch. They said she carried a dagger hidden in her gown and kept tiny vials tucked into her sleeves. Every sudden death in the palace, whether from fever or fainting, was laid at her feet, as if an invisible hand guided the fate of those who crossed her. Among her fiercest enemies stood Maria Josefa Alvarez de Toledo y Guzman, Duchess of Medina Sidonia, heiress to one of Castile's oldest and most powerful houses, proud of her lineage and openly hostile to Bourbon power. She saw in Elizabeth nothing more than a foreign intruder. During a glittering banquet, with candles blazing and violins humming, the Duchess lifted her voice above the hall. Spain needs a queen, not an Italian nurse with bottles of strange waters. Laughter rippled through the nobles, yet Elizabeth only offered a frozen smile, her eyes as steady as stone. Days later, an invitation arrived. Medina Sidonia entered the queen's private chamber, stripped of music and merriment. A long table was set with porcelain jars that gave off a mingled scent of herbs and iron. Elizabeth poured tea, her gaze resting on the Duchess with unnerving calm. "Tell me, milady." Her voice was soft but unyielding. "Have you noticed how pale your skin has grown? How your hand trembles when you raise a cup?" The Duchess faltered, lowering her eyes to the faint blotches that marked her own flesh. Elizabeth lifted one of the porcelain vessels, tilting it so the candlelight caught the liquid within. "These remedies your house has trusted for generations seep slowly into the blood. I know how to slow their work. I know how to keep you alive. But loyalty, too, is a kind of medicine. No threats were needed, no blade, no poison, only fear woven into words." Medina Sidonia bowed her head, her lips quivering. When she left the chamber, she carried no defiance, only silence. Chroniclers such as the Marquis de San Felipe later observed that from that moment, the resistance of the grandees collapsed. The proudest houses bent quietly to Elizabeth, their whispers hushed by the dread she had sown. Whether she had truly saved lives or merely conjured illusions, no one could say. What mattered was that the Italian queen had turned suspicion itself into power. In the twilight, between cure and curse, Elisabeth Farnese bound the nobility of Spain to her will, not with armies or decrees, but with the terror that survival depended on her hand. The Palace of Madrid lived in the shadow of a king who no longer resembled the sovereign painted in grand portraits. Philip V, heir of the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, was consumed by darkness that no crown could lift. He wandered his chambers through the night, whispering fragments of prayers until his lips bled. He refused to change his clothes, wearing the same garments for weeks, convinced that to remove them would invite death. At times he trembled so violently that servants fled, fearing they witnessed not illness but possession. Whispers in the corridors blamed the blood of the Habsburgs, a legacy of marriages too close, a curse carried through veins that once ruled half the world. Courtiers spoke of it as the punishment of dynasties, a madness that grew with each generation. When Philip collapsed into trances, eyes staring at invisible torments, many believed they were watching the living echo of that ancient doom. Into this storm stepped Elisabeth. She did not recoil as others did. She sat at his side in the dim glow of candles, her hands steady as she prepared drafts of herbs and mixtures learned from years of study. She would lift the vessel to his lips, murmuring words that blurred between comfort and command. Sometimes the king would resist, shaking his head like a frightened child. She would lean close and whisper so only he could hear. "Drink, Philip, only I can silence the voices." And he obeyed. José Servi, the physician summoned from Italy, recorded in his notes the strangeness of the queen's influence. He described a monarch who resisted medicine yet yielded when Elisabeth approached. Servi saw symptoms that no remedy could explain, tremors and obsessions that seemed born of both body and spirit. He suspected that the queen was not only nursing, but controlling. Yet he wrote with careful caution, knowing that any word spoken aloud might end his own career. The atmosphere of the court grew heavier with every passing month. Nobles dared not speak openly, but their eyes followed the queen whenever she entered the king's chambers with her small porcelain vessels. Some believed she saved his life. Others whispered that she prolonged his torment, binding him to her hand as tightly as chains. Philip's madness deepened. He clung to priests, demanded endless prayers, and cried out at night that demons clawed at his flesh. Yet in the morning, it was Elisabeth who emerged from his rooms, calm and composed, announcing that the king was resting. None could challenge her, for only she seemed able to keep him breathing. So the question haunted Madrid. Was Elisabeth Farnese the devoted wife who kept a broken monarch alive? Or was she the silent sorceress who held Spain itself in a state of dependence? Through her care, the monarchy survived. But beneath that survival lay a fear more powerful than any decree. The fear that one woman alone decided whether the king would rise or fall. The chandeliers of the royal palace blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting against marble pillars and gilded mirrors. Bells rang through the corridors as nobles filled the hall, their jewels glittering, their whispers a tide of expectation. It was meant to be a solemn ceremony, a moment to remind Spain of its strength. Philip V entered. The music faltered. The king's figure was gaunt, his shoulders bent, his eyes darting as though hunted by unseen enemies. Murmurs spread like a chill draft. As the officiant prepared to speak, Philip's body stiffened, his lips twisted. His voice rose in a broken cry. He clutched at the air, shrieking about shadows and demons pressing close around him. The assembly froze in terror. Then panic rippled outward. Ladies drew back, men crossed themselves, and guards shifted uncertainly. The king staggered, his knees giving way, and with a thud he collapsed before the eyes of his horrified court. In the chaos, one figure advanced. Elisabeth Farnese walked forward with measured grace, her gown sweeping across the marble, her face unreadable. She knelt beside her husband, laying her hand firmly on his shoulder. From her sleeve, she drew a small porcelain vessel and held it to his lips. The liquid touched him and for a breathless moment the hall hung between fear and hope. Slowly, Philip's trembling eased. His cries softened to whispers, and silence fell over the chamber. The king lifted his head, pale as wax, his gaze wandering over the crowd before fixing on the woman beside him. His voice cracked, yet carried clearly through the hall. "Only she keeps me from the abyss. From this moment you will hear her as you would hear me." Every noble froze, struck as though by lightning. Elisabeth rose with a calm authority that seemed greater than any crown. Her voice cut through the silence, steady and cold. "The king has spoken. From this day my command is his command. To resist me is to resist the king himself." Heads bowed in waves. Some hands trembled against embroidered coats. Among them, the proud Duchess of Medina Sidonia bent her knee, her earlier defiance buried beneath fear. That single gesture echoed louder than any proclamation. No one dared to mock the queen again. The whispers of the Italian witch dissolved into obedience. What remained was the memory of a frail monarch rescued before their eyes, and of a queen who stood unshaken at the center of the storm. Elisabeth stood alone in the glow of the candles, the small porcelain vessel still in her hand. It was not a sword, nor a scepter, yet in that instant it held greater power than armies. The narrator's voice lingers over the image. Spain was no longer ruled by a trembling Bourbon king, but by a queen of Parma who had transformed fear itself into a throne. When Philip declared before the court that her words were his own, Elisabeth seized more than the crown. She seized the machinery of empire itself. Ministers no longer dared to move without her signal, and ambassadors quickly learned that every treaty, every alliance, every promise passed first through her chamber. She became the unseen player in a vast game, pushing pawns and queens across the chessboard of Europe. Her greatest triumphs wore the faces of her children. Charles, her beloved son, was crowned King of Naples and Sicily as Charles VII. Years later, he returned to Spain as Charles III, a monarch remembered for rebuilding the empire's strength and laying the foundation for the Bourbon dynasty that still endures. Another son, Philip, was established as Duke of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla, reviving the Farnese legacy in Italy and planting a branch of her bloodline that could not be erased. Her daughter Maria Teresa Raffaella was given in marriage to King Louis XV of France and bore the title Dauphine of France, binding the Bourbons of Madrid and Versailles together in one knot of flesh and destiny. Each of these placements was not chance but design. Elisabeth wove marriages, treaties, and alliances with the precision of a master strategist. Though the Spanish grandees seethed at her influence, they were forced to admit that their kingdom's heirs sat securely because of her hand. In the salons of Madrid, the whispers grew bitter. They said the Italian witch had sown seeds from her own blood. They claimed she had used not beauty but fear as her ink when writing treaties. Yet time, merciless as ever, stripped away her triumph. When Philip V died, her shield vanished. No longer the queen who could calm a tormented king. She became a widow confined within the walls of La Granja de San Ildefonso. Courtiers who once bowed in dread spoke of her with contempt, calling her a foreigner who had bent Spain for her own design. Still, even as they cursed her name, they lived under monarchs who reigned only because of her ambition. In the silence of her last years, she wandered cold corridors, servants noting that she kept a single porcelain vessel beside her mirror. It was cracked and fading, but she touched it often as though it held the sum of her power. One evening she sat before her reflection, her hand trembling on the vessel. No one knew if it had given life or stolen it, only that her dynasty still breathed because of it. And so the image remains, a queen in solitude, a vessel of Paracelsus in her hand, and a question that history has never answered. Was she the loyal wife who preserved her husband's life, or the Italian sorceress who ruled Spain through a poison only she could measure? The voice of the narrator closes with gravity. Power is not always carried by crowns or by swords. Sometimes it is hidden in a single drop, where life and death are divided by a breath. Subscribe now and follow us deeper into the hidden corridors of history, where every secret waits to be uncovered.